Jared Thompson hunched his shoulders as he walked through the rusted gates of William Harding High, his heartbeat drumming in sync with the scuffed soles of his sneakers against the cracked pavement. The air smelled of damp concrete and old gum, remnants of last night's rain lingering in dark puddles across the courtyard. Students moved in clusters, laughing, shoving, trading stories from the weekend, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony of adolescence. But Jared wasn't. A part of that he never was. His eyes remained fixed on the ground, his mind preoccupied with one thought: getting inside without losing what little money he had. The first checkpoint was always the same, right by the steps leading to the main entrance. A group of boys stood like sentinels, backs against the wall, their eyes scanning the incoming students like predators searching for prey. Reggie Coleman was in the center, wearing his signature varsity jacket, his freshly lined-up fade catching. The morning light, his father's legacy, cast a long shadow over the school, making him untouchable. Everyone knew it, and Reggie wore that power like a crown. Jared felt the weight of their stares before he even reached them. His stomach tightened as he instinctively checked his pockets, making sure the folded $5 bill was still there. It wasn't enough, not today, but it was all he had. "Yo, look who decided to show up," Reggie drawled, stepping forward with the lazy confidence of someone who had never been told no. Zanell and Marcus flanked him, their grins widening like hyenas scenting blood. "You know the drill, Thompson." Jared swallowed hard, willing his hands to stop shaking as he pulled out the crumpled bill. He placed it in Reggie's outstretched hand, knowing there was no point in arguing. Last time he had tried to slip past unnoticed, he had ended up in the janitor's closet with his backpack turned inside out, his homework soaked in orange juice. Reggie examined the bill, clicking, his tongue in disapproval. "Man, inflation's real, huh? $5 ain't cutting it anymore." He stuffed the money into his pocket and cracked his knuckles. "Guess we'll have to find another way for you to contribute." Jared's pulse quickened. "That's all I have," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Reggie tilted his head, considering. Then, without warning, he reached forward and yanked Jared's backpack off his shoulder. "Let's see what else you got." No, wait. Too late. The zipper was torn open, and books, pens, and loose papers spilled onto the damp ground. A gasp caught in Jared's throat as he saw his telescope, his most prized possession, tumble out, the polished metal casing clanking against the concrete. "Oh, damn! What's this?" Marcus snatched it up, turning it over in his hands. "You trying to be an astronaut or some shit?" "Give that back," Jared said, his voice shaking. Reggie smirked, snatching the telescope from Marcus and holding it up to his eye. "Yo, I think I see Thompson's future," he laughed. "Oh, wait. Nah, it's just more of him being broken pathetic." The others roared with laughter. Jared clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. But he didn't move. He couldn't. "Relax, nerd, I'm just messing." Reggie tossed the telescope carelessly onto Jared's books, the lens now smeared with dirt. "Consider yourself lucky today, but next time, bring more cash." The group sauntered off, leaving Jared frozen in place, his breaths coming in sharp, shallow bursts. The world around him felt distant, muffled by the pounding in his ears. Slowly he crouched down, gathering his things with numb fingers. The telescope's lens was scratched, not badly, but enough to make his stomach twist. He stuffed everything back into his bag and stood up, forcing himself to breathe, to move, to pretend like his day hadn't already been ruined before the first bell had even rung. By the time he reached his first class, his appetite was gone. He stared blankly at his desk, the math problems on the board swimming before his eyes. His mind replayed the scene outside over and over like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. As the day dragged on, the weight of it settled in his bones. This wasn't new. It had been happening for months, since the start of the school year. And every day it felt harder to endure, harder to keep pretending it didn't matter. When the final bell rang, Jared didn't head straight home. Instead, he wandered toward the back of the school, where the old maintenance door stood slightly ajar. It was a forgotten entrance, rarely used. He had discovered it weeks ago, and it had become his only way to avoid Reggie's toll booth. At the front, he slipped inside, his heart pounding as he moved quickly through the empty hallway. If he could just keep using this way in, maybe he could finally stop paying. Maybe he could finally stop living in fear. But as he stepped outside, a cold wind cutting through his hoodie, a voice stopped him in his tracks. Well, thought you could slip past us, huh? Jared turned slowly, his stomach dropping. Reggie stood at the edge of the alley, Darnell and Marcus on either side of him. A slow grin spread across his face as he cracked his knuckles. You trying to cheat the system, Thompson? Jared's breath hitched. His escape route, his one chance at avoiding them, had just crumbled before his eyes. Jared's mind raced as he took a step back, his foot scraping against the rough pavement behind the school. The alley was narrow, boxed in by the crumbling brick walls of the school and a rusted chain-link fence at the end. There was no easy escape, no quick way out. Reggie stood between him and the only exit, arms crossed, a smirk playing at his lips. Darnell and Marcus loomed behind him like shadows, their presence amplifying the suffocating sense of inevitability. You thought you were slick, huh? Reggie took a slow step forward, his voice calm, almost amused, sneaking in through the back like some rat. Jared's throat felt dry. He forced himself to stand his ground, even though every instinct screamed at him to run. I wasn't. Shut up. The words came sharp, cutting through the cold air. You know the rules. Everybody pays. No exceptions. Jared's fists clenched involuntarily. I don't have anything, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Reggie sighed dramatically, shaking his head. Man, see, that's the thing. You're making this way harder than it needs to be. His eyes flicked to Marcus, who immediately stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. Jared's stomach twisted into a tight knot. He knew where this was going. He'd seen it before. Other kids who thought they could escape Reggie's grip, only to end up humiliated, their clothes soaked in soda, their lockers trashed, their homework shredded. Some of them stopped coming to school altogether. He braced himself as Marcus shoved him against the wall, the rough bricks scraping against his backpack. His breath hitched as Darnell grabbed his wrist, prying his fingers open to check for cash. Empty, Darnell muttered. Reggie sighed again, tilting his head as if deeply disappointed. See, I don't like when people waste my time, Thompson. You owe me, and since you got no money. He glanced at Jared's backpack, eyes narrowing. Let's see what else you got. No! Jared's protest was cut off as Marcus yanked the backpack off his shoulders. The zipper was pulled open in an instant, and his belongings were dumped onto the pavement once again. His notebooks landed in a puddle, the pages instantly, soaking up the grimy water. Pens rolled away, disappearing into the cracks of the concrete. Then, the thing Jared had dreaded most, his telescope, clattered onto the ground, bouncing once before coming to a stop at Reggie's feet. A slow grin spread across Reggie's face as he bent down and picked it up, turning it over in his hands. Man, you really are a nerd, he chuckled. What is this, some kind of toy? Jared's heart pounded against his ribs. It's not a toy, he said through gritted teeth. Reggie raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah? Then what is it? Jared didn't answer. His hands shook with restrained anger as he watched Reggie examine the telescope carelessly, spinning the focus dial like it was nothing more than a cheap plastic gadget. It wasn't just an object. It was a piece of him. His mother had saved, up for months to buy it, knowing how much he loved astronomy, how he spent hours on the roof at night, tracing constellations and dreaming of a future beyond the Bronx. And now it was in Reggie's hands, treated like junk. A sharp snap broke the air Jared's breath caught. The focus dial had cracked, a thin fracture running along the side of the telescope. Reggie let out a low whistle. Oops, he said, not sounding sorry in the slightest. A rush of heat surged through Jared's veins, his vision going red at the edges. His body moved before his brain could catch up. Without thinking, he lunged forward, grabbing the telescope. Reggie's grip tightened instantly. Their eyes locked. For a moment, there was no sound except the sharp breaths between them. The distant chatter of students leaving school, the wind howling through the alley. Then Reggie laughed. It was a slow, cruel chuckle, the kind that sent a shiver down Jared's spine. "You got some fight in you after all," Reggie mused, shoving Jared back with little effort. "I respect that, but let me teach you something, nerd." His fingers uncurled, and in one swift motion he let the telescope drop. Jared's heart plummeted as the metal casing hit the ground with a sickening crunch. A crack split across the lens. The glass shattered into tiny shards that reflected the fading sunlight like fallen stars. Silence stretched between them. Jared stared at the broken telescope, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. Something inside him cracked along with the lens. Reggie crouched down, resting his elbows on his knees as he studied Jared's frozen expression. "Now maybe next time you'll remember your place." Darnell and Marcus chuckled, stepping back as Reggie straightened, dusting off his jacket like he had just completed a mundane task. Jared's fingers curled into fists at his sides, nails biting into his palms. Reggie turned to leave, throwing one last glance over his shoulder. "See you tomorrow, Thompson, and bring cash." Jared didn't move. He didn't look up. He didn't react as their footsteps faded into the distance. Only when he was alone did he finally let out the breath he had been holding. His chest ached, his head swam, and his knees threatened to give. Out beneath him, he sank to the ground, picking up the broken telescope with careful hands, running his fingers over the shattered lens as if he could somehow fix it just by touching it. But no matter how much he wanted to, it was beyond repair. Just like the illusion he had clung to, that he could keep avoiding this, that he could stay in the background and survive unnoticed. That illusion was gone now, and something else took its place, a slow burning anger curling in his gut like a storm waiting to break. Jared sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the broken telescope resting in his lap. His fingers traced the jagged crack running across the lens, a physical reminder of what had happened, of what Reggie had done. The anger from earlier still simmered beneath his skin, refusing to settle. He wanted to scream, to punch something, to make Reggie feel even a fraction of the humiliation and helplessness he had felt in that alley. But what could he do? The Bronx wasn't a place for daydreamers. People didn't rise through the ranks. By playing fair, and retaliation without power was a death sentence. He had no influence, no muscle, nothing that could scare Reggie the way Reggie scared everyone else. The only thing he had was his mind. And right now, his mind was telling him one thing: he couldn't keep living like this. A sharp knock at his bedroom door made him jump. He quickly set the telescope aside, wiping his face before calling out, "Yeah?" The door creaked open, and his mother, Rachel, stepped inside. She looked exhausted, still in her scrubs from the hospital, her dark curls slightly frizzed from a long shift. She carried a plate with a sandwich and a bottle of water, placing them on his desk. "You didn't eat dinner," she said softly, eyes scanning his face. Jared forced a small smile. "Not that hungry." Rachel frowned, crossing her arms. "Jared." The way she said his name told him she already knew something was wrong. She always knew. That was the thing about his mom. No matter how much she worked, how many hours she spent on her feet, she never stopped paying attention. She glanced at the telescope. What happened? Jared hesitated. He could lie, pretend he had dropped it by accident. But what was the point? Reggie. His voice was quieter than he wanted it to be. His mother's lips pressed into a thin line. She sat on the edge of his bed, her hands resting on her knees. "Tell me everything." And he did. He told her about the toll at school, about how he had been paying for months, how he skipped meals just to keep them off his back. He told her about sneaking in through the back and how Reggie had found out. And he told her, with a bitter edge in his voice, about how his telescope had been smashed right in front of him, how he had just stood there, unable to do anything. Rachel stayed silent the entire time, listening intently. When he finished, she exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over her face. "Jared, you can't let this keep happening." He let out a humorless laugh. "What am I supposed to do? Go to the principal? Reggie's got half the school wrapped around his finger." Her jaw tightened. "Then we go to the police." Jared shook his head. "And say what? That some rich kid is shaking me down for lunch money? They'll laugh me out of the station." Rachel opened her mouth to argue, but stopped herself. He was right. The system didn't work for kids like him. The moment Reggie's father got involved, any complaint would disappear faster than it was filed. A heavy silence filled the room. Then his mother reached forward, taking his hand in hers. Her grip was firm, steady. "Jared, listen to me. You are smarter than these boys, smarter than anyone at that school. And I know you. You don't want to fight them. You don't want to stoop to their level. But that doesn't mean you let them walk all over you." Jared swallowed hard. "What do I do then?" Rachel squeezed his hand. "You do what you do best. You think." The words stuck with him long after she had gone to bed. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind turning over every possibility. She was right. Violence wasn't an option. He wouldn't win that way. But information, that was a different story. The next day, Jared kept his head down at school, playing his usual role, the quiet, unimportant kid nobody noticed. But beneath the surface, his eyes were open, watching, listening. He needed leverage, something real, something Reggie couldn't talk his way out of. Then, in gym class, he saw it. Mr. Mitchell, the school's physical education teacher, stood at the edge of the basketball court, clipboard in hand, watching the players run drills. He was tall, built like an ex-athlete who still worked out occasionally, his bald head gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He was also the kind of teacher who didn't care much about rules, especially when it came to Reggie. Jared had noticed it before, but today he really paid attention. The way Mitchell casually ignored Reggie, shoving another player. The way he laughed at something Darnell whispered in his ear. And the way, when a younger student hesitated to take a shot, Reggie snatched the ball from him, shoving the kid back. The boy stumbled, hitting the ground hard, his palms scraping against the polished wood. Jared expected Mitchell to say something, anything. But the man just smirked and turned away, as if he hadn't seen a thing. Something clicked into place in Jared's mind. This wasn't just about a teacher playing favorites. This was something deeper. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Jared lingered behind, pretending to tie his shoe. He watched as Reggie and Mitchell exchanged words near the bleachers. "You good for Friday?" Mitchell asked, his voice low but clear. Reggie grinned. "Yeah, man. My dad's got the sponsorship locked in. You don't got to worry about a thing." Jared's stomach twisted. "Sponsorship?" Mitchell clapped Reggie on the shoulder. "That's what I like to hear. Keep doing your thing, kid." And, just like that, Jared had what he needed. Mitchell was protecting Reggie because of his father's money. The connection was obvious. If Jared could prove it, if he could get real evidence, then maybe, just maybe, he could take Reggie Downs. He walked out of the gym. A plan began to form. He wouldn't fight back with fists. He would fight back with the truth. Jared's heart pounded as he walked through the crowded hallway, gripping the strap of his backpack like a lifeline. The school felt different today, but not because anything had changed, because he had changed. He wasn't just another victim, waiting for his turn anymore. He had a plan, a dangerous one. If he was right about Mr. Mitchell, if the gym teacher really was turning a blind eye in exchange for Reggie's father's money, then Jared could prove it. He just needed evidence, real, undeniable evidence. That meant taking a risk. At lunch, he sat alone in the farthest corner of the cafeteria, pretending to scroll through his phone while his mind worked overtime. He thought about how he could record them, Reggie and Mitchell. The gym was too open. There were too many students and teachers moving around. He needed a spot where they felt comfortable, where they thought no one was watching. That's when it hit him. The locker room. Jared knew that Reggie and his crew always stayed behind after gym class, long after the other students had left. It was their private little kingdom, where they laughed, cracked jokes, and talked openly without fear of being overheard. If Mr. Mitchell was involved in their scheme, that's where the conversation would happen. The bell rang, signaling the start of his next class, but Jared barely registered it. He had already decided tomorrow he would get the proof he needed. The next day, Jared sat in the back row of his classes, silent, barely paying attention to anything except his plan. When gym class finally arrived, he felt his pulse quicken. He walked into the locker room, weaving through the other students, keeping his head down as he moved toward his usual spot. His phone was in his pocket, fully charged, the camera app. Ready. All he had to do was hit record. After changing into his gym clothes, he kept an eye on the room, watching as other students finished up and filed out onto the basketball court. One by one, they left, until only a few remained, Reggie, Darnell, and Marcus, still laughing about something near the lockers. Mr. Mitchell hadn't come in yet, but Jared knew he would. The key now was not getting caught. Jared moved quietly toward the far end of the lockers, where the back row cast a shadow over the floor. He slipped behind the last row, pressing his back against the cool metal. His hands were sweating. He pulled his phone from his pocket, turning the camera on, his thumb hovering over the record button. A few seconds later, the door creaked open. Mitchell's voice carried through the room. "All right, what's up?" Jared held his breath. Reggie chuckled. "Relax, man. Everything's good. I just wanted to let you know my dad's still cool with the deal. He's cutting the check for the tournament next week." Mitchell let out a short laugh. "That's what I like to hear. Keep that money flowing, and you boys keep getting what you need." Jared's thumb pressed down on the record button. Reggie leaned against a locker, a cocky grin in his voice. "Yeah, well, you know how it is. As long as I don't do anything." "Too crazy, right?" Mitchell scoffed. "Please, you think I care if some kids get roughed up? Your old man's practically keeping this school alive. Administration won't touch you, and neither will I." Jared's breath caught in his throat. That was it. That was the proof. His grip tightened around the phone, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure they would hear it. He just needed a few more seconds. Reggie laughed. "That's what I'm talking about." Mitchell clapped him on the shoulder. "Just don't get sloppy. If some kid starts crying about it, handle it quietly." Jared felt sick. This was bigger than just bullying. This was corruption. The school wasn't just allowing Reggie to terrorize students, they were protecting him. He had to get out of there. Jared carefully slid his phone back into his pocket and took a slow step back. But before he could move any further, his foot accidentally kicked something, a loose piece of metal from a broken locker. The clink echoed through the room. Jared's blood turned to ice. Silence. Then, the hell was that? Jared turned and bolted. Footsteps thundered behind him, shouts filling the air as he sprinted toward the door. He slammed his shoulder into it, bursting into the gymnasium, nearly knocking over a kid dribbling a basketball. "Yo, watch it!" Jared didn't stop. He didn't look back. He tore through the gym, past students, past teachers, ignoring the startled faces turning his way. The hallway was up ahead. If he could just make it. A hand grabbed his backpack and yanked. Jared crashed to the floor. The breath ripped from his lungs as he landed hard on his side. Pain exploded across his ribs, but before he could scramble up, hands grabbed his arms. Pinning him down, he looked up and his stomach twisted. Reggie, and he wasn't smiling anymore. Jared struggled, twisting his body, but Reggie's grip was ironclad. the weight of him pressed down like a steel trap, his knee digging into Jared's ribs. Darnell and Marcus loomed nearby, eyes sharp, muscles tense, ready to step in if needed. The gym buzzed with activity, kids playing, sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, but no one was paying attention to them. It was as if the world had shrunk down to this moment, to the pounding of Jared's heart and the fire in Reggie's glare. "What the hell were you doing back there?" Reggie's voice was low, dangerous. Jared clenched his teeth, his mind racing. He still had his phone. The recording was safe, but if Reggie figured out what he had, if they took his phone... Reggie's grip tightened on his hoodie, jerking him closer. "You think I'm stupid? You were spying on us." Jared swallowed hard, trying to keep his breathing steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." Reggie's nostrils flared, his patience thinning. "Oh, so now you're a liar." "Two?" He turned to Darnell. "Check his pockets." Jared's stomach dropped. Darnell crouched, shoving a hand into Jared's hoodie pocket. Jared jerked away instinctively, but Reggie's grip kept him pinned. His pulse roared in his ears. He had to do something. As Darnell reached for his jeans pocket, where his phone was, Jared moved fast. He bucked his body to the side, twisting just enough to break Reggie's balance. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Reggie's knee slipped, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Jared snapped into action. He rolled onto his back and he kicked upward, his foot slamming into Reggie's chest. The force sent Reggie stumbling back, cursing. The moment his weight lifted, Jared twisted onto his stomach and sprinted. He could hear them behind him, shouting his name, their footsteps, pounding against the gym floor. He had no plan, no real escape route, just one desperate thought. Get out, now! His legs burned as he burst through the gym doors, flying into the hallway. The students, still lingering between classes, barely had time to react as Jared tore past. Them, weaving through bodies, ducking between groups. He needed somewhere to hide, somewhere to think. The stairwell. Jared turned the corner, his sneakers squealing against the tile as he reached the stairwell door. He yanked it open and bolted. Up the steps, two at a time. His chest burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Voices echoed behind him. Find him! Reggie's voice was laced with fury. Jared reached the second floor and skidded into the hallway. He had to think fast. He couldn't run forever. If they caught him, they wouldn't. Just rough him up this time. They'd take his phone. They'd delete the recording, and that was not an option. His eyes darted around, searching. Then he saw it. A janitor's closet at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. He sprinted toward it, heart hammering, and slipped inside just as footsteps thundered up the stairs. The door clicked shut behind him, enveloping him in darkness. He pressed his back against the shelves, his breath shallow, forcing himself to stay still. He could hear them outside, their voices sharp, angry. He went this way, checked the classrooms. Footsteps pounded down the hall, doors opened and slammed shut. Jared held his breath. Seconds felt like hours. Then, I swear if he got away... Reggie's voice closer this time, a pause. Jared could see a sliver of light through the crack in the door. A shadow passed by. Then, nothing. Silence. He stayed there for what felt like forever, his pulse refusing to slow down. His hands were still shaking, fingers curled tightly around his phone. Eventually, the voices faded. The footsteps grew distant. He waited another full minute before finally, carefully, pushing the door open. The hallway was empty. Jared exhaled, his legs almost giving out from the adrenaline crash. He had done it. He had escaped. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Now, he just had to figure out his next move before Reggie found him first. Jared's hands were still trembling as he pressed his back against the cool metal shelves of the janitor's closet, his pulse a relentless drumbeat in his ears. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, the adrenaline refusing to fade. He knew he had to move. Staying in one place too long was a risk, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. His mind raced through possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. Reggie was hunting him. That much was clear. And after what just happened in the gym, there was no doubt in Jared's mind. Reggie would not stop until he had that phone. Jared tightened his grip around the device, his thumb grazing the screen, ensuring the recording was still intact. It was the proof of Reggie's extortion, of Mr. Mitchell's corruption. It was all there. But having the evidence meant nothing if he couldn't get it out of this school safely. He took a slow, deep breath. Think, Jared. Think. There were 3. Options 1, run home. Get out of the school before Reggie cornered him again. Too risky. Reggie's reach extended beyond these walls, and if they suspected him of going straight home, he could walk into an ambush. 2, find a teacher, a principal, any authority figure, and show them the recording. But that idea died as fast as it surfaced. Who could he trust? The administration had looked the other way for months. Mr. Mitchell had outright enabled Reggie's terror. And if the wrong person saw this before it went public, it could be buried. That left option 3, get the recording online before Reggie got to him. Jared's fingers moved quickly, unlocking his phone and pulling up his messaging app. His mother was the first contact, and for a split second, he considered sending it to her, but she wouldn't be able to act fast enough. No, he needed to do this himself. He switched to his email. The plan was simple. Upload the video and send it to every local news station, every student blog, every social media account that mattered. If the truth was everywhere, Reggie couldn't silence it. His fingers hovered over the send button. Then the door handle rattled, Jared's breath caught in his throat. The closet was small, barely wide enough for him to crouch behind a stack of cleaning supplies. If they opened the door, he was done. The handle jiggled again. Jared's heart slammed against his ribs. He forced himself to stay still, barely daring to breathe. A voice, low, sharp. You check that side. I'll check here. Marcus. Jared pressed himself further against the shelves, feeling the metal dig into his back. Footsteps, getting closer. The handle twisted again, harder this time. Then, just as Jared braced himself for the worst, yo, Reggie wants us back in the gym, Darnell's voice coming from down the hall. A pause, then a frustrated sigh. Man, whatever. The footsteps retreated. The tension in Jared's chest slowly uncoiled. He stayed frozen for another full minute before daring to move. He cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. Empty. Jared exhaled sharply. This was his chance. He slipped out, keeping close to the lockers, his body low, his movements precise. He didn't head toward the main exit. Too obvious. Instead, he made his way toward the back hallway, where the old computer lab was. The school barely used it anymore. The Wi-Fi was faster there, and the cameras didn't work. He reached the door and ducked inside, locking it behind him. Rows of outdated computers lined the walls, their screens dark and dust-covered. Jared sat at the first one and pulled out his phone. He opened his email again, attaching the recording. This is it, he typed a quick message. Proof of corruption at William Harding High School. Students are being extorted and bullied under the protection of faculty. This has to stop. He addressed it to multiple local news stations, student forums, and, at the last second, uploaded it to a private link on a cloud drive. Then, without hesitating, he hit send. The loading bar appeared. 10%, 25%, 40%. Come on, come on. A loud bang echoed from the hallway. Jared's head snapped up. More footsteps, fast, heavy. He turned back to the screen. 65%. The doorknob rattled. His stomach clenched. Yo, I saw him come in here. Reggie. Jared's pulse skyrocketed. Almost. There. Almost there. A loud thud as someone threw their weight against the door. 5%. The wood splintered. Jared scrambled back, his eyes darting between the screen and the shaking door. 5 more seconds, another slam. The lock snapped. Jared lunged for the phone, grabbing it just as the door burst open. Reggie stepped inside, his face twisted with fury. "You really don't know when to quit, huh?" Jared backed up slowly, his grip tightening on the phone. His body screamed for him to run, but there was nowhere left to go. Then, behind Reggie, Marcus and Darnell stepped. In blocking the exit, Jared swallowed hard. Nowhere left to run, no more hiding. It was time to face them. Jared's breath came fast and shallow as Reggie took a slow step forward, cracking his knuckles. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting sharp shadows across the room. Behind him, Marcus and Darnell blocked the only exit, their arms crossed, eyes locked onto him like predators waiting for their turn. The air in the old computer lab felt tight, suffocating. Jared clenched his phone in his hand, his pulse pounding so loudly in his ears that he barely heard Reggie's next words. "You think you're smart, huh?" Reggie's voice was steady, but there was an edge of real anger beneath it now. This wasn't the usual smug amusement, the casual arrogance that came with knowing he was untouchable. This was something else. He was pissed. Sneaking around, recording people, trying to play hero? Jared swallowed hard but didn't respond. His eyes flicked to the door, measuring the distance, calculating. 3 steps to Marcus, 4 to the hallway. "If I move fast enough," Reggie noticed. He smirked. "Nah, you ain't going nowhere." Jared barely had time to react before Reggie lunged. His hands shot out, grabbing Jared by the collar, shoving him back against the nearest desk. The impact sent a jolt of pain through his lower back, his phone nearly slipping from his grip. He fought to push Reggie away, but the other boy was stronger, pressing forward, his face inches from Jared's. "You don't get it, do you?" Reggie hissed. His fingers twisted in Jared's hoodie, tightening like a vice. This little game you're playing, it ends now." Jared gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep his breathing steady. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to give Reggie that satisfaction. But before he could say anything, Marcus stepped up beside them, eyeing Jared's phone. "Yo, take that," Marcus said. Reggie reached for Jared's hand, but instinct kicked in. Jared jerked to the side, twisting his body, using the movement to slip free from Reggie's grip. He barely got a step away before Darnell's arm hooked around his shoulder, yanking him back. His foot caught on a power cord, and the next thing, he knew he was falling, his back slamming into the hard tile floor. Pain exploded in his ribs. His vision blurred for half a second, and by the time he blinked it away, Reggie was already standing over him, hand it over. Jared gritted his teeth. He could feel his heartbeat in his fingers, in his throat, a rapid thrum of panic and resistance. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything but what. There was no one coming to help, no escape. And the second they got that phone, everything he had fought for was gone. Reggie crouched down slowly, grabbing Jared's wrist. His grip was tight. "I won't ask again." Jared's fingers curled around the phone instinctively. He knew this was it, the moment where everything either fell apart or changed forever. And then, out of nowhere, a loud bang echoed through the room as the door slammed open. Jared's head snapped up. Standing in the doorway was a teacher, but not just any teacher, Mr. Alvarez. He was one of the few decent ones at this school, a history teacher who didn't look the other way when things went wrong. He was older, with graying hair and a sharp gaze that instantly took in the situation. His eyes flicked from Jared on the floor to Reggie, still crouched over him, fingers digging into his wrist. "What the hell is going on here?" Alvarez's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. Reggie froze. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, Jared saw something flicker in Reggie's expression, hesitation. It lasted only a second, but it was there, a crack in the armor. Alvarez stepped into the room, his gaze narrowing. "I said, what's going on?" Jared seized his chance. He sucked in a breath and forced the words out. "They're trying to take my phone." Alvarez's brows furrowed. Why? Reggie recovered fast. He let go of Jared's wrist and stood up, slipping into his usual easy confidence. Come on, Mr. A. We were just messing around. No big deal. Alvarez didn't look convinced. His eyes flicked between them, studying the tension in the air, the way Jared was still on the floor, his knuckles white around his phone. Thompson, get up, Alvarez said. Jared moved carefully, pushing himself to his feet. His ribs ached, but he ignored it. He kept his phone tight in his grip. Alvarez turned to Reggie. You and your boys, out now. Reggie hesitated again. For a second, Jared thought he might argue, but then with a sharp exhale, he forced a grin and held up his hands. All right. We were just leaving anyway. He shot Jared a look, one that promised this wasn't over, before turning toward the door. Marcus and Darnell followed, silent but watching. Jared didn't move until the door shut behind them. Alvarez turned to him. You okay? Jared nodded, though he wasn't sure if it was true. His whole body was still wound tight, every muscle braced for another attack. Alvarez studied him for a long moment before speaking again. What's on that phone? Jared hesitated. Then slowly, he looked up and met the teacher's gaze. Proof, he said. Proof that Reggie and Mr. Mitchell have been running a racket in this school. Proof that people have been getting hurt because no one's stopping them. Alvarez's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. He crossed his arms. Show me. Jared's pulse pounded as he unlocked the phone and pulled up the recording. He handed it to Alvarez, watching as the teacher listened. In silence. By the time the video ended, Alvarez's jaw was tight. His fingers gripped the phone just a little harder than before. This is serious, he muttered. Jared exhaled. I know. Alvarez handed the phone back. His face was unreadable. For a long moment. Then he nodded. We're going to do something about this. Jared's stomach tightened. He had been waiting to hear those words for months, but as much as relief threatened to sink in, he knew one thing for certain. Reggie wasn't done, and when he came back, because he would come back, he wouldn't be playing games anymore. Jared sat in Mr. Alvarez's classroom, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk, his mind a tangled mess of exhaustion and adrenaline. The recording was still fresh in his ears, looping over and over in his head. He had done it. He had undeniable proof. But now that the moment was here, a sick feeling settled in his gut. Because if Reggie found out Alvarez had seen the video, things would escalate fast. Alvarez paced near his desk, his brow furrowed as he processed everything he had just seen. The usually composed teacher looked shaken, his grip tight around the edges of his notebook. Jared didn't blame him. This wasn't just bullying. This was corruption, blackmail, and school-sponsored violence, all hidden under the surface of their so-called normal school. Alvarez finally stopped, exhaling sharply. Jared, you understand what this means, right? Jared nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. Yeah, Alvarez studied him for a moment, then reached for his desk phone. I'm calling the principal. This has to be dealt with now. Panic flared in Jared's chest. He straightened in his chair, his pulse spiking. Wait, Alvarez hesitated, his fingers hovering over the buttons. If you go straight to the principal, Jared said, choosing his words carefully, Reggie's gonna know it came from me. And if he knows that, he won't just scare me. Next time, Alvarez's face darkened. He was sharp enough to understand what Jared was saying. Reggie had power, not just over his crew, but over the entire school. The second this got out, the balance would shift, and Reggie wouldn't go down quietly. We have to be smart about this, Jared pressed. If we let the school handle it internally, they could sweep it under the rug. You saw what Mitchell said. He's part of this. His fingers curled into a fist. The only way this works is if it can't be ignored. Alvarez lowered the phone slowly, his jaw clenched. He wasn't the kind of teacher to back down from a fight, but even he knew the system wasn't built to protect kids like Jared. It was built to survive. And survival meant protecting people like Reggie Coleman and his father's money. Jared reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I already sent the recording out, the local news stations, social media, student forums. Even if the school tries to hide it, people will see it. Alvarez's brows lifted slightly, a flash of something, impressed, concerned, crossing his face. That's smart, he admitted. Risky as hell, but smart. Jared swallowed. I just don't know how long we have before Reggie finds out. As if on cue, the intercom crackled to life. Reggie Coleman, to the principal's office, immediately. Jared and Alvarez exchanged a look, and then the shouting started. It came from the hallway, angry, sharp, filled with disbelief. Jared recognized Reggie's voice instantly. What? The next few seconds were chaos. Jared could hear footsteps stomping down the hall, students murmuring, teachers stepping out of classrooms to see what was going on. Then came the slamming of lockers, hard, loud, a sound filled with pure rage. Then Thompson. Jared's blood turned to ice. It was like the entire school held its breath. Alvarez moved fast, stepping toward the door before Jared could. Stay here. Jared barely had time to react before Alvarez was out the door, his voice firm, cutting through the noise. Reggie, enough. You're not making this worse for yourself. Jared could hear his own heartbeat. He could hear Reggie, breathing heavily just outside, could picture the fury in his eyes, the way his hands probably curled into fists. Then Reggie's voice, low and seething. You don't get it, Mr. A. This isn't over. Jared exhaled slowly, gripping his phone. Like a lifeline. He knew it wasn't over, and that was the problem. Jared sat rigid in his seat, every nerve in his body screaming at him to move, to run, to do something, but he forced himself to stay still. Outside the classroom, the tension in the hallway thickened like a storm ready to break. He could hear Reggie breathing hard, could feel the rage radiating through the air. The school was watching, waiting, uncertain if the golden boy of William Harding High was finally about to fall. Mr. Alvarez stood between them, arms crossed, his stance firm. You need to calm down, Reggie, he said, voice steady, controlled. I suggest you go to the office before you make this worse for yourself. Reggie let out a sharp laugh, but there was no humor in it. Worse for myself? His voice was pure venom. Nah, man, this ain't about me. This is about him. Jared tightened his grip on his phone, his palms slick with sweat. He knew Reggie wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after being exposed in front of the entire school. He was cornered, and a cornered predator was the most dangerous kind. The hallway had gone dead silent. Students lined the lockers, eyes darting between Reggie and Alvarez, whispering, murmuring. Then Reggie stepped forward, his voice dropping, low. You think this changes anything? His gaze flicked past Alvarez, locking onto Jared through the open doorway. You think some stupid video makes you untouchable? Jared forced himself to meet Reggie's eyes. I think it makes you powerless. The words hung in the air, razor sharp. Reggie's jaw clenched, and for the first time a flicker of something other than anger crossed his face, something dangerously close to panic. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by pure hostility. Alvarez shifted slightly, keeping himself between them. Enough, he said, steel in his tone. Principal's office, now. Reggie's hands curled into fists, his knuckles white. For a second, Jared thought he might actually swing. But then Reggie exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You just signed your own death warrant, nerd. Then he turned and walked away. Jared barely had time to breathe before Marcus and Darnell followed, throwing one last glare in his direction before disappearing down the hall. The moment they were gone, the school erupted. Murmurs turned to outright. Conversations, Students whispering, pulling out their phones, sharing the video, the confrontation. Jared could feel the shift in the air. The fear of Reggie was still there, but something else had taken root now. Something new. Doubt. People were questioning everything. Reggie had ruled this school for years, untouchable, unstoppable, but now he had been called out, publicly. His name was already spreading online, his reputation splintering like glass under pressure, and Jared had been the one to do it. Alvarez exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose before turning to Jared. "Are you okay?" Jared nodded, though his hands were still shaking. "Yeah." Alvarez studied him for a moment, then motioned for him to stand. "Come with me, we're going to the principal's office." Jared hesitated. "To do what?" "To make sure this doesn't disappear," Alvarez said. "You've done your part. Now let's make sure it sticks." Jared knew he was right. The school would have to take action now. The video was everywhere. But part of him still couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As they walked toward the office, students whispered as he passed. Some looked at him with something close to admiration, others with caution, and some with fear. But Jared wasn't afraid anymore. He had set something in motion, and there was no stopping it now. But as he reached the office doors, he couldn't shake the feeling that Reggie wasn't done. Not yet. Jared stepped into the principal's office, the weight of the past 24 hours pressing against his shoulders like a heavy chain. Mr. Alvarez walked beside him, his presence steady, reassuring, but it did little to calm the storm raging. Inside Jared's chest, he had made his move, thrown the first punch, not with his fists but with the truth. And now the entire school was watching to see what would happen next. Principal Owens sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. He was an older man, graying at the temples, dressed in his usual stiff suit. He had the look of someone who had spent years balancing school politics with actual education, someone who picked his battles carefully. Jared knew exactly what kind of man he was. "Mr. Thompson." Owens folded his hands on the desk, glancing at Alvarez. "I assume you're here about the situation." Jared's grip tightened around his phone. "The situation?" He almost laughed. "You mean the evidence of bullying, extortion, and a teacher covering it up?" Owens's jaw tensed. "Watch your tone." "No," Alvarez cut in before Jared could snap back. "He's right. We're past sugarcoating things. This school has a serious problem, and now the entire city knows about it." Owens exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. "Yes, we're aware of the video." Jared watched him carefully, his stomach twisting. Aware. That was an interesting choice of words. Not concerned, not outraged, just aware. "Reggie Coleman is currently in the office with his father." Owens continued. "There is an ongoing discussion regarding the next steps." Jared's pulse spiked. "And what does that mean?" "It means we're handling this internally." Owens's voice was firm, but there was something behind his words, something practiced, calculated. Jared felt his chest tighten. They were trying to sweep it under the rug. Alvarez must have realized it too, because his expression darkened. "With all due respect, Principal Owens, that's not an option anymore. This isn't just some schoolyard fight. This is a pattern of abuse covered up by faculty members. Mitchell protected that kid because of his father's money. The entire school saw it. Hell, the entire Bronx saw it. You think this just disappears?" Owen's jaw clenched. He leaned back, eyes flicking toward Jared. "You have no idea what kind of pressure I'm under. Do you know how much Coleman's father has done for this school?" Jared's stomach turned. "There it is. It's always about the money," he muttered. Owens frowned, looking at him fully now. "And what exactly do you want, Mr. Thompson?" Jared met his gaze without hesitation. "I want justice. I want Reggie expelled. I want Mitchell fired. And I want every student who's ever been extorted by them to be safe." His hands curled into fists. "I want this school to stop protecting bullies just because their parents write checks." Silence filled the room. Owens's face remained unreadable. Then, slowly, he leaned forward. "You don't understand how the world works, kid," he said, his voice quieter now, almost tired. "It's not about fairness, it's about survival, and sometimes survival means compromise." Jared felt something snap inside him. "Not for me," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, strong. "Not anymore." Owens studied him, searching for something in his expression. Jared didn't look away. Finally, the principal sighed. "Reggie Coleman is suspended indefinitely. Mitchell is being investigated." Jared frowned. That wasn't enough. "Suspended? That's it?" Owens held up a hand. "This is the first step. If more students come forward, they will," Jared interrupted. "Now that they're not scared anymore." Owens exhaled through his nose, nodding slowly. "Then we'll reassess." Jared wanted to argue, wanted to demand more, but a voice in the back of his mind reminded him this was a war, not a single battle. And for now, this battle was a victory. Alvarez nodded. "We'll hold you to that, Principal Owens." Jared didn't bother thanking him. He turned and walked out, his hands still clenched, his mind still racing. The second he stepped into the hallway, students turned to look at him. The whispers started immediately, eyes flicking from him to their phones. The news was spreading fast, but Jared didn't stop. He walked with purpose, past the lockers, past the faces, past the fear that had ruled this place for so long. Then, at the far end of the hall, he saw him, Reggie, standing near the office, his father beside him. His expensive jacket looked pristine, his posture stiff, but his eyes, they were different now. The smug arrogance was gone. There was something else behind them. Rage. Jared met his stare, unflinching. Reggie smirked. It wasn't the usual cocky grin, it was something colder. Then he mouthed two words. "This isn't over." Jared's jaw tightened. No, it wasn't.
If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.